I grew up in a small town in the hills of southwestern Kentucky, not too far from an old abandoned coal mine. There were rumors that it was haunted, and one time, me and my middle school buddies walked up there and just kind of stared at the entrance for a while, daring each other to step inside but never getting any closer. I told my mom about it, and she told me to stay away from the place. I thought that was proof that the place was haunted, but she said those rumors were nonsense and that the place was just dangerous, especially for curious little boys like us. Our town didn't just have a haunted mine either. We had our very own haunted house too. It was actually about a mile out of town, and I only ever saw the place when I was driving out that way with my dad. But every time we passed, I stared and wondered if there really were ghosts walking around that big old place. It must have been a pretty nice place at one time. 3 floors, balconies on the second, with a big old gravel driveway lined with trees. It looked like a mansion to me when I was a kid, but it was also boarded up, falling down, and absolutely derelict. At first, all I heard was that something terrible had happened there. Some people got murdered and that their ghosts were hanging around the place because they couldn't move on. But my dad said that was bullcrap too. He also told me that I was too young to be asking those kinds of questions and that he'd tell me all about it when I was older. Well, many years later, when we were both much older, I asked him what happened out at that old big house outside of town, and this is what he told me. At one time, the house had been owned by the Fairfax family, one of the richest in all of Kentucky. They got rich from owning shares in coal mines, and as the family's wealth grew, so did their holdings. They mined the hills around Whitesburg, Cumberland, and McRoberts for almost 100 years, and by the time the Fairfax Mining Corporation was owned and operated by a Maxwell Fairfax around the turn of the century, the family owned half the coal mines in Perry and Letcher counties. It was Maxwell who had the house constructed, and he considered it his own small contribution to the family's legacy, the seat of power from which they'd rule over the Kentucky mining industry for another 100 years. Maxwell was supposedly a shrewdly intelligent businessman, one who rarely made mistakes. But in choosing his heir, he made a mistake that was fatal not just to the Maxwell Mining Corporation, but his entire bloodline. Maxwell's protege and the heir to the family fortune was his eldest son, William Fairfax. Maxwell taught his son everything he knew about the family business, and when he finally passed away in the early 1930s, William stepped up to take his place. William then started off on an aggressive expansion project, buying land here and staking claims there. It paid off for him, too. Their investors were happy, their customers were happy, and I hear he offered very fair wages, too. Needless to say, he was a popular man, one who'd earned the right to call himself a Fairfax. But the same eagerness by which he cemented his reputation would eventually become his undoing. William Fairfax opened 6 new mines in as many years, but to do so, he had to skirt all kinds of state and federal regulations. This was no issue for a man of such vast wealth and power, and even less difficult was the act of procuring land from those less fortunate than he. One of these poor landowners, a Choctaw man whose name had been lost to history, sold his land to Fairfax at a discount. And this is a very important detail of the story, but one we'll revisit later on. Anyway, Fairfax does the same thing across southeastern Kentucky, opening up brand new coal mines as he went. For a while, everything was running smoothly and profits were steadily increasing. But then one day, William Fairfax calls a meeting with the mining company's top guys and makes a shocking announcement. Following the end of that work week, all mining operations were to shut down with immediate effect. Needless to say, the board of the mining company was horrified. To their knowledge, the company was doing just fine. They were unaware of any financial difficulties, none of the mines were anywhere near depleted, and there had been no attempted takeover of the company, hostile or otherwise. But Fairfax went one step further. Once all mining operations had been halted, The company was to completely dissolve, with all employees and board members to be laid off immediately. This second move caused a veritable poop storm. The miners the company employed were devastated, but generous redundancy payments quickly eased their suffering. The same went for the board members, who each got the equivalent of a couple of $1 million in today's value. A check that size surely saw them through the winter, and other mining companies were crying out for workers, so very few of Fairfax's former employees went destitute. But all anyone wanted to know was, why? Why shut down one of the most successful mining operations in the entire region? Well, the answer is disputed, and I'll tell you the one that I believe before the one I don't want to believe. The first explanation is that Fairfax knew something his board members didn't, and that's how the company's entire investment structure was about to fall out from under them. For one reason or another, Fairfax and his top investor had endured a bitter falling out, so bitter that his investor had promised that Fairfax would never work with a single American financier for as long as he lived. The guy was apparently so well connected that he had the ear of all the money men in Lexington, and so in the time it took to say a few rude words, William Fairfax had doomed his family's beloved mining company, his very legacy, to a slow death. But then, instead of stripping the assets or potentially risk leaving his employees destitute, William Fairfax rather nobly neglected the opportunity to protect his fortune in favor of ensuring his workers and board members did not go hungry. Now, obviously, this was a really nice thing to do, but I'm sure you'll all agree that it seems pretty out of character for a super-rich coal baron like Will Fairfax, and from what I can gather, it was pretty out of character for him. Fairfax emulated his father in that he was a shrewd businessman. He paid his employees fairly, but he worked them hard, so when he starts just giving his money away all of a sudden in what amounted to generous severance packages, people thought he was crazy. And the sad thing is, that seems like it was true. So as I mentioned, Fairfax declared that the company would continue through the working week before ceasing operation, presumably to fulfill contracts so he could better compensate his employees. But during those days, Fairfax appears to have acted out of character. He was giving away his fortune, shrugging off the board members' accusations that he was throwing away his family's legacy. But that's all the subjective crazy stuff you could just as easily put down to having a good heart. But as time went on, and the week drew to a close, Fairfax supposedly went from acting out of the ordinary to acting in a way that was downright frightening. He stopped eating. He looked like he hadn't slept. And people had said that he'd be talking away one minute, then the next, his words would get all garbled, like he was jabbering nonsense. And there was other stuff too, like how he'd be reading or looking at something and then just suddenly jerk his head to one side as if searching for the source of a sound that no one else could hear. I don't know if anyone sought to make any kind of intervention, and by that I mean get Fairfax to a psychiatrist, or even to just a general hospital of some kind, but if there was one in the works, it came far too late. Sometime later, I'm not sure exactly how long, but I figured it was maybe a week tops, folks around town realized they hadn't seen any of the Fairfax family at all. Williams hadn't been seen since the mine closures, but neither had any of his family, and his wife and daughter were often seen visiting stores around town, while his son was fond of riding over to the town saloon to drink and play cards. They were regular visitors and popular too, so when all three of them suddenly stopped showing their faces around town, people started to talk, and that talk eventually led to the town sheriff heading over to the Fairfax place to check on the family. What he actually found there took years to make it to the ears of the wider public, but what the sheriff could bring himself to say was that upon entering the Fairfax house, it became evident that William, his wife, and their 2 children were all deceased. At first, all the townsfolk knew was that the Fairfax family had passed, and although many assumed it was some kind of tragic accident, others grumbled that William hadn't been well as of late and were obviously concerned for his recent state of mind. Rumors were rife, but the fact remained that no one but the sheriff and his boys had seen the inside of the Fairfax house. They managed to keep a lid on things for a day or two, but then the law stated that the Fairfax's bodies had to go over to the coroner, and when that happened, the sheriff and his boys couldn't keep things quiet anymore. The Fairfaxes hadn't been lost in some tragic but unavoidable accident. William Fairfax had murdered his own family. I think the most common explanation tagged onto this version is that Fairfax knew that his family were doomed to be impoverished. They weren't accustomed to such a lifestyle either, so rather than watch them suffer and grow to resent him, William Fairfax decided to put them out of their misery before it even visited them. It makes for a pretty horrible story, right? Man loses fortune because of his own hubris. Then after quite possibly losing his mind, he decides to kill his family instead of allowing them to live in poverty and misery. Seems like it's all there, doesn't it? And personally, that's the version I like the best. But there's another version, one that a frightening amount of people believe, and to be honest, when you get your hands on that coroner's report, it's not as easy to dismiss as you might think. For the first part of this second and much more terrifying explanation, we gotta circle back and touch on the land Fairfax bought from that Choctaw man at heavy discount. Fairfax could have, and probably would have paid 10 times what he ended up paying for that land, seeing as there was this huge coal seam running the backside of the hill this guy's land was on. Yet, he only ended up paying a fraction of the estimate. The question is, how did he manage to obtain such a reduction in price? Well, you ask certain people, who I politely refer to as the Fairfax's official historians, the discount was agreed upon due to the Choctaw man's desperation. He needed fast money, and was in no room to negotiate, and was willing to accept a much smaller sum of money so long as it was paid in cash. But ask other people, and they give you a very different explanation. Fairfax got his hands on that land so cheap because the Choctaw made a very special request of him. If he promised to fulfill it, he could have the land, and the promise was this. Up in the hills, on this old Indian guy's land, was an old Choctaw charnel house. They sometimes called them bone houses or bone caves, but whatever the name, they were held as deeply sacred places by the natives. Following the death of a Choctaw, their friends and or family would place their bodies up in a tree, or if there were none available, they'd construct a kind of primitive scaffolding and then place the body of the deceased at the top. The idea was that carrion birds, or flesh strippers as the natives called them, would remove all the tissue, spiriting away the soul of the dead so that their bones could be safely stored in one of those bone caves I just told you about. And so the land Fairfax bought was host to one of those bone caves, and the discount he received was conditional. The Choctaw man refused to sell unless Fairfax made a promise to him that the bone cave would remain untouched. Supposedly, Fairfax gave the man his word that the bones of his ancestors would be respected, but then sooner had the Choctaw taken his money and rode off into the sunset, Fairfax ordered the bone house demolished. Apparently, the quickest and most direct route to the coal seam was directly through the bone cave, and although Fairfax was more ethical than most, profit trumped decency every single time. And so, Fairfax went back to his promise almost right away, and, on his order, workers packed the cave out with dynamite and then blew it sky high. Now, as compelling a story as that all is, there's not an ounce of evidence to support it outside of local hearsay. But what there is evidence for, and this is evidence I've seen with my own 2 eyes, is that the Fairfax family annihilation wasn't quite what the official historians have made it out to be. You see, when the sheriff and his boys showed up at their place, they were greeted by a vision of hell. But it wasn't no average murder scene, if they even exist at all, as following the slaughter of his family using a combination of knife stabs and hammer blows, William Fairfax dragged their bodies outside, each wrapped in expensive cotton bed sheets, and began placing their bodies in the trees that lined the driveway to their home. The coroner report states that Fairfax had attempted to strip away some of the flesh from his family's bodies, but for some reason had stopped himself during the act and had instead opted for the trees. Now, I'm not saying that Fairfax fell foul of some ancient Choctaw curse. What I'm saying is, I think he believed that. Maybe it's because he really was losing his mind. But whatever the reason, after killing his wife and 2 children, Fairfax started to mimic the Choctaws' burial rites. To this day, no one knows why Fairfax did what he did. They got their guesses, but even folks like me who lean away from the supernatural have a hard time piecing together the details in a way that doesn't give you the creeps. The nation of Ireland is famous for many things. Throughout the centuries, the country has produced some of the greatest artists, musicians, and poets the world has ever known, and quite arguably the world's greatest beverage too, Guinness. The iconic Irish stout was first brewed in 1778 by Arthur Guinness at Dublin's St. James Gate Brewery. Almost 2 decades prior, the man himself signed the now legendary 9,000-year lease on the brewery, and it wasn't until the late 1770s that the brewery began producing the dark, creamy stout that would give the Guinness family name its now global fame. The exact story behind the drink's initial creation is very poorly documented, but it's commonly believed that Mr. Guinness experimented with several different techniques and ingredients in the effort to create a new, distinctive kind of beer. The use of roasted barley, which gave Guinness its distinctive jet black color, along with its characteristic flavor, is one of the key elements that sets it apart from other beers. And over the centuries that followed, Guinness has become one of the most recognizable and beloved beer brands on the planet. But did you know that the story of Arthur Guinness's descendants is one as dark as the drink which bears their name? This is the story of the Guinness family curse. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, the Guinness family amassed a sizable fortune from the export of their beer. They bought their way into the aristocracy, became a giant on international stock markets, and so intertwined themselves with the Irish culture that wherever there are Irish people, pints of Guinness are being poured. But as their wealth accumulated, a pattern of highly publicized tragedies fueled rumors of a Guinness family curse. The family itself had dismissed such claims, telling the Irish Times that any big family will have its share of grief. But the frequency and severity of the events has many putting stock in more sinister explanations. Firstly, of Arthur Guinness's 21 children, 11 of them passed away before reaching adulthood. Granted, child mortality rates in the late 18th century were considerably worse than they are now, but even by those days' standards, burying one of your young children every 2 years for 2 decades would be enough to convince anyone their family was cursed. Tragedy continued following Arthur's death, with alcoholism and mental illness plaguing his grandchildren and descendants. Yet it wasn't until the 20th century, and the mass proliferation of print and analog media, that a noticeable pattern of tragedies seemed to emerge. Born in March of 1880, Walter Edward Guinness, or Lord Moyne as he was known, was the great-great-grandson of Arthur Guinness. He was a war veteran, a close friend of Winston Churchill, and an accomplished businessman in his own right. But like so many others, Guinness heard the call of duty at the outbreak of World War II and offered his services to both king and country. Churchill awarded him the position of Minister of State in the Middle East, and although he served both honorably and admirably, his tenure was doomed to end in tragedy. In the early afternoon of November 6, 1944, and at the height of the Second World War, Lord Moyne arrived by car at his colonial residence in Cairo. He was being driven by an Army Lance Corporal and was in the company of 2 assistants when the group were ambushed by 2 gunmen from a Zionist paramilitary organization known as Lehi. As one of Lord Moyne's assistants went to open the front door of the residence, the driver got out to open the door for Moyne, and a man named Eliyahu Betzuri emerged from a hiding place and shot his driver in the chest. Another man, Eliyahu Hakim, then pulled open the car door and shot Lord Moyne 3 times. The first bullet hit him in the neck on the right side, just above the collarbone. The second penetrated his abdomen, punctured his intestines, and became embedded in his spine, while the third shot, fired after Moyne raised his right hand, ripped across 4 of his fingers and punched into his chest. The 2 gunmen then fled the scene on rented bikes, but after one of Lord Moyne's surviving staff raised the alarm, they were chased down by an Egyptian motorcycle policeman and placed under arrest. Lord Moyne was rushed to a nearby hospital, and after briefly regaining consciousness, some believed that he might survive. Just minutes after arriving at intensive care, he was given the first of 3 blood transfusions, which initially caused his condition to improve. Yet after complaining of a burning sensation down his right leg and an inability to move it, X-rays revealed that the injury was to his spine, and shortly afterwards, his right arm also became paralyzed as a result of the neck wound. Doctors were reluctant to operate until his condition improved, but at around 5:30 p.m., a lumbar puncture revealed a blood stain, and it was decided to operate. Lord Moyne was given a 4th blood transfusion, and in the operation that followed, surgeons removed a bullet lodged near the 2nd lumbar vertebra. And in the process, doctors discovered the injuries to his colon and large intestine. Soon after the operation, Lord Moyne's condition failed to stabilize, and within just a few short hours, he began to rapidly deteriorate. Doctors did everything they could to save his life, but sadly, Lord Moyne passed away at exactly 8:40 p.m. He was 64 years old. The following day, his remains were flown home to England before being cremated on November 17th at Golders Green Crematorium. Yet the wartime tragedy did not end there. Just months before the end of the Second World War, Arthur Onslow Edward Guinness, who was the 32-year-old heir to the family business, was killed in action fighting in Holland. Yet even before the assassination of Lord Moyne and the death of young Arthur, the Guinness family seemed prone to unfortunate scandal. Brian Guinness, the son of Lord Moyne and a man of gentle nature with a willingness to please, found himself romantically involved with one of the infamous Mitford sisters, Diana Mitford. The couple married in 1929 and were well-known socialites around London, but beginning in 1932, things started to go downhill. That same year, Diana Mitford had a chance encounter with one Sir Oswald Mosley, who soon became the infamous founder of the British Union of Fascists, more commonly known as the Black Shirts. The pair commenced a torrid affair, and the following year, Diana abandoned Brian and their 2 children. She would later marry Mosley at a ceremony in Berlin, where none other than Adolf Hitler was one of the wedding guests. Born in 1945, Patrick Brown was the son of Una Guinness, an heir to the Guinness fortune. He was a central part of London's social elite during the swinging 1960s, and rubbed shoulders with artists, gurus, aristocrats, and revolutionaries. Patrick's home became a hotspot for all types of people, and the young heir became friends with the likes of the Rolling Stones, Jimi Hendrix, the Beatles, and even a skinny young man named Dave Jones, who would later perform under the name David Bowie. Patrick lived large, and he also lived fast, and true as ever to the age-old saying, he died young. On December 18th of 1966, Patrick was racing through southwest London in his light blue Lotus Elan when he crashed into a stationary minivan. He was rushed to the hospital, but sadly, Patrick did not survive his injuries, and he was declared deceased at the tender age of 21. Just a month later, British newspaper The Daily Mail published the coroner's report which detailed the cause and events surrounding Patrick's untimely death. Around 5 months later, music lovers all over the world lowered the needle onto a newly released record and heard the following lyrics. I read the news today, oh boy, about a lucky man who made the grade, and though the news was rather sad, well, I just had to laugh. I saw the photograph. He blew his mind out in a car. He didn't notice that the lights had changed. A crowd of people stood and stared. They'd seen his face before, and nobody was really sure if he was from the House of Lords. Patrick's death, and perhaps the Guinness curse by proxy, had been immortalized with the stroke of a Liverpool boy's pen and will forever remain a beloved excerpt of the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper album. Following Patrick Brown's death, the next in line to the Guinness family fortune was Lady Henrietta Guinness. Henrietta had already been plagued by several very public romance scandals, but following her untimely inheritance, her fortunes turned fatal. Lady Henrietta Guinness was with her boyfriend, Britain's best-known beatnik, Michael Beebe, when he crashed his flame-red Aston Martin into the French Riviera. The accident left her badly injured and severely mentally scarred. Tragically, in 1978, Lady Henrietta, at the age of 35, threw herself off the Ponte delle Torri bridge, as reported by the Irish Times. Having been treated for depression for some time, she is known to have once said, "If I had been poor, I would have been happy." More recently, the curse of the Guinness family appears to have struck once again, but this time in the year 2005. The latest victim was a wealthy landowner killed by a cocktail of heroin, cocaine, and drink, addictions that have reaped a bitter harvest from the brewing family in the past. Robert Hesketh, a 48-year-old father of 3, died in his sleep after taking the drugs at a country house party in the English county of Wiltshire. His body was found by his wife, Catherine, daughter of the Guinness heir, Lord Moyne, in their locked bedroom the morning after the party in November. She told an inquest in Salisbury that she had been unable to get into the room at the home of the Guinness family near Marlborough during the early hours of the morning after an 18th birthday celebration for the eldest son of their hosts. She told the inquest that she was unaware of her husband's drug use, adding that she spent a lot of time at their London home and it was possible he was taking them without her knowledge. Mr. Hesketh, a close friend of musician Jools Holland, was found dead when Erskine Guinness broke into the room of Fosbury Manor. Dr. Adnan al-Badri, a pathologist, told the inquest that Mr. Hesketh died from central nervous system depression and heroin toxicity with alcohol and cocaine. The 1,600-acre Churchtown estate has now passed to Mr. Hesketh's only son and heir, 11-year-old Frank Hesketh. And we can only hope that Frank, who will now be in his 30s, has inherited all the money and none of the bad luck. On June 1st of 2001, citizens of the small, mountainous South Asian nation of Nepal received news which brought the entire country to a standstill. Almost every member of Nepal's royal family had been slaughtered and what appeared to be an attack by a lone gunman. Yet as the day wore on, the situation took a dramatic turn for the worse. It emerged that the crazed shooter was none other than the royal family's very own Crown Prince Dipendra. Born on June 27th of 1971, Dipendra was the eldest child of Birendra, the Crown Prince of Nepal, and the Princess Aishwarya. After graduating high school in the capital Kathmandu, Dipendra went on to study at the UK's Eton College before beginning a career in the Nepalese military. Known as Dippy among his friends, Dipendra was friendly, outgoing and surprisingly humble for a young man who was often addressed as Crown Prince or even His Royal Highness. He was outgoing, athletic, and openly called for a generous expansion of the Nepalese welfare system. He was also a patron of the Nepalese Boy Scouts and occasionally spent time writing essays on the subjects of nationhood and national identity. To many, Dipendra represented the future of Nepal's royalty. Little did they know, he would be the instigator of its very downfall. On the evening of June 1st, once the grounds of the royal palace had been secured, Nepal's Chief Justice held a press conference and read the following statement to a gathering of the nation's media. On the 1st of June 2001, Crown Prince Dipendra opened fire at a house on the grounds of the royal palace, the residence of the Nepalese monarchy, where a party was being held. He shot and killed his father, King Birendra, his mother, Queen Aishwarya, and 7 other members of the royal family, including his younger brother and sister, before shooting himself in the head. The citizens of Nepal were shell-shocked. How could their beloved crown prince have done something so utterly horrifying? The Chief Justice went on to announce that since Dipendra had survived the self-inflicted gunshot wound, he had technically inherited the throne upon the death of his father, King Birendra. He lay in a hospital bed in a comatose state, both a mass murderer and a monarch. In the days that followed, many questions were asked of both the Nepalese government and its subordinate security services. But without a doubt, the overarching question remained: why? Had Dipendra suffered some kind of sudden psychotic break, shot his family in a daze, and then taken his own life when he realized what he'd done? Or had he deliberately killed them? In which case, what prompted his decision to do so? To this day, there have been no definitive conclusions on why Dipendra carried out the murder of his family, but a number of sometimes contradictory theories remain prevalent. The first theory centers around a rejected bid for marriage, one which caused Dipendra to descend into a murderous rage. While visiting the United Kingdom, Dipendra had met an Indian girl by the name of Devyani Rana. Then, upon returning to Nepal, Dipendra announced that he was in love with Devyani and wished to marry her. Supposedly, King Birendra rejected his son's proposal, claiming that the girl's family were a lower class and that her father's political leanings also left a lot to be desired. What's more, the king and queen had already picked out a prospective bride for their crown prince, and having ensured that she was of aristocratic Nepalese stock, they would not budge on their decision. This is supposedly when Dipendra flew into a murderous rage, gunning down his family in the heat of passion before finally turning his weapon on himself. However, a few of this story's details simply do not add up. Firstly, Devyani Rana was most certainly not lower class, and King Birendra would have almost definitely have known this. Her family was descended from former Indian royalty, and were actually much wealthier than the Nepalese royal family. In fact, upon hearing that her daughter was in love with the Crown Prince of Nepal, Devyani's mother warned her that the move might result in a sharp decline of her standard of living. It also seems highly out of character for someone like Dipendra, who was intensely passionate about Nepalese nationhood, to insist on marrying an Indian woman after having known her a relatively short amount of time. It also seems even more out of character for Dipendra to fly into a murderous rage over just about anything, at least not of his own volition anyway. This also pokes holes in the theory that Dipendra murdered his family after his father, the king, suggested that they completely dissolve the monarchy following the end of his reign. And even so, if Dipendra did intend the murders to be a violent coup d'etat, why take his own life once he believed everyone to be dead? Others have looked to other areas of the investigation, where they claim chilling inconsistencies. Many have questioned why there wasn't more security at the party where the attack took place, while a number of people had pointed out that Dipendra's supposedly self-inflicted gunshot wound was located at his left temple, something which struck them very unusual for a right-handed person. The Nepalese government then shocked the world by refusing any and all help from friendly nations, asserting the burden of the tragedy was theirs to carry alone. This might strike many as decidedly dignified, but some, Scotland Yard included, found it deeply suspicious that Nepalese officials seemed so allergic to foreign intervention, raising the question, what exactly did they have to hide? On the day following the royal massacre, the slain were given a state funeral and cremated in front of one of the holiest Hindu temples in all of Nepal. As we've covered, Dipendra was proclaimed king while comatose in a Kathmandu hospital. But just 4 days later, he slipped away during the night and was announced dead the following morning. Upon his passing, a distant relative named Gyanendra Shah ascended to the throne in a turn of events that surprised him just as much as everyone else. Some say Gyanendra's strange behavior in the days that followed were a result of the man's deep and profound grief, and others assert otherwise. In one instance, Gyanendra rather publicly suggested that the royal massacre was the result of an accidental discharge, as in Dipendra shot his entire family with a fully automatic assault rifle by accident, and he later defended his decision to publicly suggest such a theory, saying he was bound to tradition to avoid the suggestion that his distant cousin was a murderer. But some have argued that Gyanendra's public statement was also an attempt to skirt legal and constitutional hurdles and ensure that if he survived, Dipendra would be exempt from prosecution. If true, this would constitute a horrifyingly shrewd attempt to seize power. Perhaps Dipendra was relying on trusted surgeons to save his life following the self-inflicted wound. Maybe passing away from the self-inflicted wounds simply wasn't part of Dipendra's fiendish plan. Maybe his true intention wasn't to end the royal line forever, but to ensure its survival for another 1,000 years. On June 12th of 2001, a Hindu ceremony known as Akato was held in the Nepalese capital in order to exorcise or banish the spirit of the dead royals. A Hindu priest dressed himself in the late King Birendra's belongings, then rode an elephant out of Kathmandu as a way of symbolizing his exile into death. The Nepalese citizenry grieved bitterly, and the world wept with them. Yet as the ceremony unfolded, a deep sense of resentment towards Gyanendra began to grow. Many pointed out that on the day of the massacre, Gyanendra had rather conveniently been unable to attend the event at which it took place. Others countered that Gyanendra's wife and 2 children did make it to the party, meaning it was highly unlikely that he agreed to be part of any such plan to end their lives. However, while every single member of Dipendra's family met their end that day, Gyanendra's wife and 2 children miraculously survived their injuries. Slowly but surely, in the eyes of many Nepalese citizens, the single most compelling piece of evidence to suggest Gyanendra's innocence became one of the most damning suggestions of his guilt. In the years that followed, elements within the Nepalese Maoist Party claimed that the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency executed the massacre. Nicknamed Prachanda, one communist official asserted that multiple people with the mask of the Crown Prince Dipendra were present in the room at one point. Prachanda also asserted that there were dramatic inconsistencies between the official version of events, which were endorsed by Gyanendra and his government, and the eyewitness accounts of the medics and police officers who attended the royal palace in the aftermath of the massacre. It was also Prachanda's opinion that Dipendra was not in fact the perpetrator of the massacre, but yet another of its many victims. He pointed out the fact that the gunshot wound was not where a right-handed shooter would have placed the barrel of his weapon, and placed the blame squarely at the feet of the newly crowned King Gyanendra. But others, perhaps those with much more fruitful imaginations, placed their belief in our final theory, one involving an 11th century Hindu mystic. Gorakhnath was a revered saint, yogi, and a prominent figure in the Nath tradition of Hinduism. He believed to have lived during the 11th and 12th centuries, although precise historical details about his life are uncertain due to the hagiographic nature of many accounts. Goraknath is considered one of the influential figures of the development of Hatha and Kundalini Yoga, and is often credited with the spread of yogic teachings across India as well as the wider region. Today, he is still revered by millions of Indians and Nepalese, and in both countries, numerous temples and shrines dedicated to him can be found. Goraknath is often depicted as a yogi with supernatural powers, and his teachings emphasize the importance of spiritual practice, self-discipline, and the attainment of enlightenment. Many of the stories detailing his life and work involve him being kind, gentle, and understanding, but one such story has a markedly different tone. According to the legend, the first ruler of Nepal was named King Prithvi, and he is credited with uniting the kingdom following the conquest of numerous petty kingdoms. One day, in the late 1760s, the king came across an old holy man practicing yoga in the forest. Being a man of great respect, the king offered the holy man some curd to quench his thirst, but after consuming it, the holy man vomited into the king's drinking bowl and demanded he drink it. Naturally, King Prithvi was repulsed and tossed the holy man's fresh vomit onto the ground. But this caused the holy man to fly into a rage, claiming that the refusal to imbibe the fluid of a holy man is tantamount to a mortal sin. King Prithvi laughed, but this only angered the holy man further, and after focusing all of his divine will, the man put a curse on King Prithvi's bloodline, claiming that his royal lineage would last no longer than 10 generations. Obviously, anyone who puts a curse on you after offering you some puke to drink is probably playing with a few cards short of a full deck. But upon hearing of the curse, the great yogi Goraknath grew ashen. Goraknath claimed that despite his evident madness, the man was still a very, very powerful yogi, and that his curse should be taken very seriously. Some dismiss the warning as far-out nonsense, yet it appears that history did indeed vindicate our curd-vomiting yogi. King Prithvi was born in April 1743, and if a generation is said to be anywhere between 25 and 30 years, this means 10 generations is anywhere between 250 to 300 years. Between the year of King Prithvi's birth and the massacre of the Palace Royal Party, 258 years elapsed. Exactly 10 generations since the mad yogi declared the royal family's doom. There are many, and perhaps rightfully so, who dismiss the timing of the family's demise as mere coincidence. There are many other, much more feasible explanations, but the fact remains that hundreds of thousands of North Indian Hindus believed that Goraknath had indeed prophesied the end of the royal lineage. And with belief and manifestation being so chillingly interlinked sometimes, perhaps the moment young Dipendra learned of it, it ceased to be ancient rumor and became destined to be self-fulfilling. For many years, America knew the Getty family as one of the wealthiest in the entire world. They continue to own several prominent businesses, including Getty Images, one of the largest providers of stock photographs in the world. Chances are, if you've ever used Google image search, you've seen a picture with a Getty Images watermark. Yet the family is famous for another reason, and this one is considerably darker. The Getty family began with George Getty, an oil man from the state of Oklahoma. He and his son, Jean-Paul Getty, later known as J. Paul Getty, teamed up to start Getty Oil, a company that continued to exist until it was sold shortly after the millennium and moved its base of operations to California. J. Paul brought the family to great heights, but his father believed that he would ruin the family business, and it was probably out of spite that J. Paul didn't run Getty Oil into the ground and opted to vastly expand the family fortune. The curse, however, seemed to only afflict those who came after J. Paul Getty. Most people believe that the curse was karmic retribution for how terrible J. Paul was to his family. He married 5 times. His children rarely saw him, and J. Paul even skipped out on his eldest son's wedding after deciding the business was more precious than his own flesh and blood. Perhaps the first tragedy to hit the family was the death of Timothy Getty, J. Paul's youngest son, who died of a brain tumor in 1958 at the tender age of just 12 years old. In her book, Alone Together, Timothy's mother claimed that J. Paul had once scolded her for spending too much on the child's cancer treatments. The 1970s were an increasingly tragic time for the Gettys. The third son, John Paul Jr., left his wife and took up with the actress Talitha Pohl in 1966. The two became addicted to drugs, causing J. Paul Sr. to cut off his son completely. Pohl went on to die of a drug overdose in 1971. Older brother George always felt their father's cruelty the most. He was chief operating officer of Getty Oil, but J. Paul didn't trust his business savvy and often overrode his decisions. George, who was reportedly scared of Mr. Getty, as his children called him, often drank to numb the pain. One night in 1973, after an argument with his wife over J. Paul, George went into a room, drank alcohol, took sedatives, and stabbed himself with a barbecue fork. It took an extra 20 minutes to bring him to a discreet hospital where he died. J. Paul tried to cover up his son taking his own life so it wouldn't mar his image. The month that followed saw the worst tragedy the Gettys ever experienced. In July 1973, J. Paul Jr.'s son, J. Paul III, was enjoying a vacation in the Italian city of Rome. But then one morning, his mother received a horrifying letter stating that he'd been kidnapped and was being held for ransom. The family thought it was a ploy by the young man to extort money from his famously frugal grandfather, but in reality, none other than the notorious 'Ndrangheta Mafia had kidnapped J. Paul III. The boy's grandfather, J. Paul, refused to pay the $17 million ransom, saying that the rest of the grandchildren could be targets if the family settled. He didn't budge even when the kidnappers sent the family a lock of the boy's hair in his severed ear. And eventually, grandfather relented after negotiating to reduce the ransom. He agreed to pay $2.2 million, the most that can be tax deductible, and loan the remaining $800,000 to his son. J. Paul III was a captive for 6 months, and it traumatized him forever. He became addicted to drugs and suffered a drug-induced stroke which left him paralyzed and unable to speak, and he died in 2011. In 2015, Gordon Getty's son Andrew was found dead in Beverly Hills, naked from the waist down and lying in a pool of blood, said the Los Angeles Times. His death was attributed to a heart condition exacerbated by drugs. And then, in November 2020, another of Gordon's sons, John Gilbert, died in a San Antonio, Texas hotel from an accidental overdose. Despite the family's success, the Getty name lives on in its businesses, philanthropic ventures, and the many museums named after them. It's clear that even with all the money in the world, you can't buy happiness. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 7 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit r/Let'sReadOfficial, or send it over email and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks from members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, butter is not always the answer.